You get that ink out of a cereal box, old-timer? The voice cut through the morning quiet of the diner like a blade. Robert Hayes didn't look up from his coffee. At 81, stirring sugar into the dark liquid deserved more attention than the 2 mountains of muscle looming over his booth. He could feel their presence, the sheer density of them, wearing civilian clothes that failed to hide what they were. The speaker leaned forward, scarred knuckles planted on the table. "I'm talking to you. That tattoo." He gestured toward Robert's left forearm, where faded black ink showed a serpent swallowing its tail, a 5-pointed star trapped inside the circle. The lines were thick, blurred by decades, looking more like a forgotten doodle than a proud emblem. "What about it?" Robert's voice was a low rasp. He finally lifted his gaze. Pale blue eyes clouded with age held a placid stillness that seemed to unnerve the young operator. "Some kind of biker thing? What's it called? The geriatric guzzlers?" The smirk was cruel, practiced. The diner's quiet breakfast hum died completely. Everyone was watching now. Before we continue, if stories of quiet dignity and hidden heroism inspire you, type respect below. And tell me where you're watching from. This story proves that true honor doesn't demand recognition. I read every comment. The second operator, quieter with thoughtful eyes, touched his partner's shoulder. "Daniels, leave it alone." But Daniels ignored him completely. His focus was locked on the old man like a predator who'd spotted weakness. "I'm curious what it's supposed to be. You serve? What were you, a cook? Maybe pushing pencils somewhere safe?" The condescension dripped from every word. The diner, a place called Miller's Corner just miles from Fort Bragg, had been filled with the comfortable sounds of morning. Forks on plates, coffee pouring, low conversations. Now there was only silence, spreading outward from Robert's booth like ripples in dark water. The waitress, Linda, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and permanent tiredness etched into her face, froze mid-pour. She knew Robert. He came in every Tuesday and Thursday, ordered the same thing, asked about her grandchildren, left tips that were far too generous for a single cup of coffee. Robert took a slow sip of his coffee, placed the cup down with a hand that didn't shake. "It's just something from a long time ago." "A long time ago," Daniels mimicked, drawing the words out mockingly. "You serve? What were you? Quartermaster Corps? Supply clerk?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a stage whisper meant for everyone to hear. "Or did you just get that done in some back alley shop to impress the ladies?" The regular customers, construction workers grabbing breakfast before shifts, a retired teacher who came for the blueberry pancakes, a young couple with a baby, all stared. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious. But no one intervened. What could they do against 2 men built like armored vehicles? "Something like that," Robert said quietly, his eyes drifting toward the window as if the conversation had already become a distant memory. This response infuriated Daniels even more. He'd expected deference, fear, maybe anger he could feed on. Instead, he got nothing but calm indifference from this frail old man in a worn cardigan. "You know what we don't like?" Daniels said, his voice hardening. "Stolen valor. People pretending to be something they weren't. Wearing things they didn't earn." He jabbed a thick finger toward the tattoo. "That ink on your arm, I've never seen it. Not in any unit, not in any book, and trust me, I know them all." The second operator, his name was Martinez, finally spoke up, his voice low and urgent. "He's not claiming anything, man. We're on leave. Just let him drink his coffee." "No." Daniel's voice was sharp as broken glass. His eyes never left Robert's face. "I want to know. I want to hear the story. What's it mean, old man?" "What war story goes with your 50-cent tattoo?" Robert's gaze returned from the window. It wasn't challenging. It wasn't afraid. It was something far more unsettling, a look of profound, bone-deep weariness, as if he were seeing not just this arrogant young man, but a long procession of them stretching back through decades. "It means something," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "To the people it's supposed to." The simplicity of the answer seemed to enrage Daniels further. "That's it? That's all you got?" He leaned in until Robert could smell the protein shake and aggression on his breath. "I think you're full of it. I think you spent your war peeling potatoes and got that thing done to feel important." Linda, the waitress, had heard enough. She set down her coffee pot with a sharp clink that made several people jump. Her hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a cold, controlled anger. She'd served men like Daniels before. Young, strong, so certain of their own superiority that they'd forgotten basic human decency. The cook, an older black man named Wesley who'd been flipping eggs for 30 years, stopped his work. He leaned through the service window, his eyes on the scene unfolding. He caught Linda's eye. She gave him the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. At the corner booth, the retired teacher, Margaret Foster, who'd taught history for 40 years, slowly reached for her phone. Her fingers, twisted with arthritis, moved deliberately. She didn't know what she was going to do with it, but she felt she needed to document this somehow. Witness it, the cruelty being casually dispensed on a Tuesday morning over eggs and coffee. "You know what I think?" Daniels continued, his voice rising now, performing for the room. "I think you're one of those guys who hangs around bases, picks up the lingo, gets some random tattoo, and plays dress-up with a service you never earned." He straightened up, looking around at the other customers as if inviting them to share in his righteousness. "It's disrespectful, to real warriors, to the men who actually fight." Martinez grabbed his partner's arm. "Daniels, stop! This isn't—" "Real warriors," Robert repeated softly, as if testing the words. Something flickered deep in his pale eyes. Not anger, something older. "Is that what you are?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't a challenge. It was genuine curiosity, asked in the same tone someone might use to inquire about the weather. But somehow, it cut deeper than any insult could have. Daniel's jaw tightened. He was used to intimidation working, used to his size and bearing making people back down. This old man's quiet dignity was like water eroding stone, subtle, persistent, unstoppable. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Yeah, we are, which is why I'm going to ask you one more time. Where did you get that tattoo? What unit? What year? Give me specifics or admit you're a fraud." In the kitchen, Wesley pulled out his own phone. He had a nephew who worked on base, security forces. He sent a quick text. "Trouble at the diner, 2 soldiers harassing an old man, might need MPs." What nobody in that diner knew, not Linda with her shaking hands, not Wesley texting his nephew, not Margaret recording on her phone, not even Martinez who sensed something was terribly wrong, was that in approximately 4 minutes, 3 black government vehicles were going to screech into the parking lot with enough force to shake the windows. And nothing in that diner would ever be the same again. But those 4 minutes hadn't arrived yet. For now, there was only the weight of Daniel's demand hanging in the air, and Robert Hayes looking at him with those clouded blue eyes that seemed to see through time itself. "The tattoo doesn't come with a story for everyone," Robert said finally. His voice remained soft, but there was something underneath it now, something that made Martinez take an unconscious step back. "Some things are earned in ways that don't translate to moments like this." Daniels laughed. A harsh, barking sound. "There it is, the mystical veteran routine. You wouldn't understand. I can't talk about it." He mimicked Robert's raspy voice cruelly. "That's what phonies always say when they can't back up their lies." Linda had made her decision. She walked quickly to the back office, a cramped space that smelled of old paper and coffee grounds. She pulled out her cell phone with trembling fingers. She didn't call the MPs. Some instinct told her this required a different kind of intervention. Her cousin, Rachel Bennett, worked as an administrative assistant at the Joint Special Operations Command building. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. Rachel answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. "General Thornton's office, Senior Airman Bennett speaking." "Rachel, it's Linda," she whispered urgently. "Listen, I don't have time. There are 2 of your guys here. I think they're special operators or something, and they're harassing one of my regulars. An old man. Linda, I'm in the middle of something." Rachel's voice held bureaucratic impatience. "If they're causing trouble, call the MPs." No, you don't understand. Linda's voice cracked. The old man's name is Robert Hayes. They're mocking a tattoo on his arm. She closed her eyes, remembering the image. It's a snake in a circle eating its tail, with a star in the middle. The silence on the other end was total. It stretched 3 seconds, 4, 5. When Rachel's voice returned, all the professional crispness had evaporated, replaced by something Linda had never heard from her younger cousin, pure, crystallized fear. Describe it again. Exactly. Linda did. Every detail she could remember. The faded black ink, the serpent, the 5-pointed star. And the name is Robert Hayes. Rachel's voice was barely controlled. Yes. Now are you going to... Do not let them leave. The line went dead. Back in the diner, Daniels had decided words weren't enough. He reached out and tapped his finger against Robert's tattoo. A dismissive, contemptuous gesture meant to prove the old man was powerless. The touch was light, almost casual. But for Robert Hayes, it was as if someone had thrown a switch. The smell of coffee and bacon grease vanished. In its place came the thick metallic scent of blood and wet earth. The clatter of dishes became the distant rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors. He wasn't in a vinyl booth anymore. He was crouched in humid jungle, rain dripping from massive leaves. A young man's voice whispered urgently in his ear. Stay with me, Hayes. Just stay with me. He remembered the makeshift needle, a sharpened piece of bamboo dipped in gunpowder and ink. It was done in silence, in a hidden camp deep in territory they weren't supposed to exist in. 5 men. 5 points of a star, a promise made in blood and shadow, the serpent eating its tail, the circle, the eternal return, the promise to never forget the ones who didn't make it home. He blinked. The jungle disappeared. He was back in the booth. Daniel's finger was still touching his arm. Robert slowly, deliberately, pulled his arm back. His expression hadn't changed, but something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. Something ancient and immovable. Outside, 3 black Chevy Suburbans with government plates were already moving through traffic at dangerous speeds, emergency lights hidden in their grills beginning to flash. The countdown had begun. Inside the Joint Special Operations Command headquarters, Senior Airman Rachel Bennett felt her hands go numb. She'd been working in this office for 3 years. She'd processed countless classified documents, sat in on briefings she'd signed her life away not to discuss, heard whispers and ghost stories from old sergeants major about operations that never officially happened. But she'd never heard fear in her boss's voice until now. General Marcus Thornton, 4 stars, commander of all Special Operations Forces in the United States military, was in the middle of a top-secret briefing with his component commanders. The room was soundproof, lined with technology that would make a smartphone spontaneously combust. You did not interrupt this briefing, not for anything short of nuclear war. Rachel decided this was close enough. She walked to the heavy door and knocked. A colonel opened it, his face a mask of irritation. "Airman, this better be—" She pushed past him. Every head in the room turned. Some of the most dangerous men in the world, commanders of forces that didn't officially exist, staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to fury. General Thornton looked up from the head of the conference table. His eyes were like flint. "Airman Bennett, this had better be the end of the world." Rachel walked directly to him, her training overriding her terror. She leaned down and spoke in a voice only he could hear. "Sir, I apologize. I received a call from my cousin off base. A man named Robert Hayes is being harassed at Miller's Corner Diner by 2 active duty operators. They're questioning his service." She paused, her voice trembling. "Specifically mocking his tattoo, a serpent in a circle with a 5-pointed star." The change in General Thornton was instant and terrifying. The color didn't drain from his face. It was replaced by something dark, something that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. Every commander at the table flinched back, sensing predator instincts they'd honed over decades of warfare. Thornton stood so quickly his chair screeched backward and nearly toppled. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It was a low, guttural command that cut through everything. Get my detail. Get my vehicles. Now." He looked at the assembled commanders, colonels and generals who ran the most elite forces on Earth. "This meeting is over." One of them, a hardened brigadier general who'd spent 30 years in special operations, made the mistake of asking, "Sir, what's Project Omega?" Thornton's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of classified history. The brigadier general's face went pale. Every man in the room suddenly understood. They'd all heard the rumors. The ghost unit that predated everything. The men who wrote the playbook in blood. Thornton was already moving toward the door. "If Robert Hayes is who I think he is, then 2 of my operators are currently humiliating one of the 5 men who invented modern special operations. The 5 men who went into Laos in 1968 and somehow walked back out." He paused at the door, his voice dropping even lower. "Only 2 of those 5 are still alive. And if someone is touching his tattoo..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Back at the diner, Daniels had no idea what he'd set in motion. He stood over Robert Hayes with a smug expression, having just made his final, fatal error. Putting his hands on a warrior whose legend was written in files so classified they were literally blacked out of existence. "All right, Grandpa," Daniels said, his voice hard. "I think we've had enough of this. Let's you and me take a walk outside. We can discuss respect." He was threatening to physically assault an 81-year-old man in a public diner. Linda, watching from the kitchen doorway, felt her heart hammering. Martinez grabbed his partner's shoulder. "Daniels, no! What are you doing?" But then they all heard it. A sound that made every head in the diner turn toward the windows. Not sirens. Something deeper, more ominous. The rumble of powerful engines moving at combat speed. 3 black government-plated Suburbans screamed into the parking lot with enough force to make the diner's windows rattle. They executed a perfect tactical formation, blocking all exits with military precision that spoke of countless missions in hostile territory. Before the vehicles had fully stopped, doors flew open and men emerged, not in combat gear, but in razor-sharp service dress uniforms, the command security detail. Serious-faced sergeants major and master sergeants who moved with synchronized precision that transformed the parking lot into a high-security zone. Daniels and Martinez froze. They recognized those vehicles. They recognized the formation. The arrogance drained from Daniels' face, replaced by a sickly pallor and the first cold tendrils of pure dread. The rear door of the lead Suburban opened. General Marcus Thornton stepped out. 4 silver stars glittered on his collar. His face was set in an expression of barely controlled fury that made hardened warriors take unconscious steps backward. He didn't acknowledge anyone. His eyes locked on the diner's entrance, and he strode toward it with purpose that seemed to bend reality around him. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. The sound was absurdly gentle given what was about to happen. The general filled the doorway, his presence sucking oxygen from the small space. He ignored the stunned patrons. He ignored the operators who'd gone rigid with shock. His gaze swept the room and found the man in the booth. He walked directly to Robert Hayes. His polished shoes stopped inches from the table. Daniels still had his hand on Robert's shoulder. The general's eyes flicked down to that hand, and the look in them was so venomous that Daniels snatched his hand back as if burned. Then General Marcus Thornton did something that no one in that diner could have predicted. He clicked his heels together. His back went ramrod straight. And in a greasy spoon diner that smelled of bacon and burnt coffee, the highest-ranking Special Operations Commander in the United States military snapped to the sharpest, most profound position of attention and rendered a perfect textbook salute to the frail old man in the booth. Time stopped. The only sound was the hiss of the grill in the kitchen. Every eye in the diner was locked on this impossible scene. The salute held for 5 full seconds, an eternity in military tradition. Then, slowly, the general lowered his hand. When he spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion none of his operators had ever heard from him. "Robert, it's been too long." Robert Hayes looked up at him, and a faint, sad smile touched his weathered lips. "Marcus, you got old." The general allowed himself a brief, grim smile. Then his attention turned to Daniels and Martinez. The warmth vanished from his face, replaced by Arctic fury. "You!" He pointed at Daniels. "You questioned this man. You questioned his tattoo." Daniels could only produce a strangled, choking sound. Words had abandoned him entirely. The general didn't wait for a response. With slow, deliberate movements that commanded absolute attention, he unbuttoned the cuff of his right sleeve, rolled it up past his wrist, past an expensive watch, and there, on the forearm of a four-star general, was the exact same tattoo. The serpent eating its own tail, the five-pointed star in the center. His was newer, the lines crisper, but it was an identical match to the faded ink on Robert Hayes's arm. A wave of shock rippled through the diner. Margaret Foster, the retired teacher, gasped audibly. Linda pressed her hand to her mouth. Wesley stood frozen in the kitchen window, his spatula forgotten. "Let me tell you who you were speaking to," General Thornton said, his voice low and dangerous but loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is Robert Hayes. Before there was SEAL Team 6, before there was Delta Force, before there was any official Special Operations Command, there was a handful of men sent into the dark to do the impossible." He took a step closer to the operators, his voice dropping even further. "They were called Project Omega. They were ghosts. Their missions were never recorded. Their names were never spoken. This man and 4 others founded the very tradition you think you represent." The general's words hung in the air like smoke. Every person in the diner was holding their breath, afraid to break the moment. Thornton continued, his voice carrying the weight of classified history. In 1968, his team was sent on a mission so classified it's still blacked out in every file, deep into Laos. They were compromised, hunted for 3 weeks by 3 entire battalions. His jaw tightened. Robert Hayes carried a wounded teammate, me, when I was a young lieutenant barely out of training, on his back for the last 2 days, through swamps and enemy patrols to reach the extraction point. Martinez's eyes widened. He'd heard rumors. Every special operator had. Whispered stories about the men who came before, the originals, but they were treated like myths, like Arthurian legends in camouflage. Of the 5 men who wore this mark, the general touched his own tattoo with reverence. Only 2 are alive today. You're looking at both of them. He let that sink in, the weight of survival settling over the room like a heavy blanket. The serpent eating its tail represents the eternal nature of their mission. The 5-pointed star, those were the 5 of them. Each point representing a man who went into hell and somehow walked back out. Thornton turned his attention fully to Daniels now, and his voice became surgical in its precision. "You wear the uniform of the quiet professional. That's our creed. Today you forgot the quiet part. You forgot the professional part. You forgot that every single thing you have, every piece of gear you use, every tactic you employ, every breath you take in the field, was paid for in blood by men like him." The rebuke continued, quiet and devastating. "You forgot to respect your elders. You forgot to honor your lineage. You forgot to ask questions before making judgments. You forgot everything that matters." He looked both operators up and down with utter contempt. "My office. 0500 tomorrow. Be prepared to turn in your credentials." He'd just ended their careers in the elite tiers with a single sentence. The dream both men had worked their entire adult lives to achieve. Gone. Daniels's face crumbled. Martinez looked physically ill. The magnitude of what they'd done was finally crashing down on them like an avalanche. They hadn't just disrespected an old man, they'd humiliated a living legend. They'd mocked a founder of everything they'd sworn to uphold. As they stood there, shattered and pale, Robert Hayes slowly pushed himself out of the booth. He rose on unsteady legs, gripping the table for support. The years showed in his movements, the weight of 8 decades and countless missions taking their toll. But when he spoke, his voice was clear. He looked not at the general, but at the 2 young operators whose lives he'd just watched implode. His pale blue eyes held no anger, no triumph, just a profound, bone-deep weariness and something that might have been pity. "The tattoo doesn't make the man," Robert said softly. "The man makes the tattoo mean something. All this, He gestured vaguely at the general, the uniforms, the power on display. It comes and goes. Ranks change. Units are created and disbanded. But your character, sons, that's the only thing you truly own. Try not to lose it. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a man who'd seen young warriors full of fire come and go for over 50 years. Men who'd lived and men who'd died. Men who'd honored the profession and men who'd disgraced it. He looked at his old friend. "Buy me a coffee, Marcus. It's been a while." General Thornton put a steadying hand on Robert's shoulder. The same shoulder where decades ago, during that impossible mission in Laos, Robert had carried him through enemy territory, while Thornton drifted in and out of consciousness from a gunshot wound. "Yes, sir," Thornton said quietly. The formal address wasn't military protocol. It was personal respect from a man to his mentor. As they turned to sit back down, one more memory flickered through Robert's mind. Not the jungle, not the ambush, but a quieter moment after. A makeshift aid station. A much younger Marcus Thornton, his arm bandaged, wincing as Robert himself applied the ink with that crude bamboo needle. "It's a promise to remember the ones who aren't here," Robert had said that day, half a century ago. "And to never, ever quit. Now you're one of us. For life." The fallout from Miller's Corner was swift and total. General Thornton didn't just discipline two operators. He recognized a systemic problem, a generation of warriors so focused on the present that they'd lost connection to their past. Within a month, he instituted a new mandatory training block for every special operations candidate. It was called Legacy. Not taught by active instructors, but by vetted veterans from Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, men like Robert Hayes, flown in to share stories that would never appear in history books. The lessons that could only be learned through blood and time. Daniels and Martinez weren't discharged. Thornton believed that would be too easy, too clean. Instead, they became the permanent administrative staff for the Legacy program. For 3 years, their job was coordinating travel, setting up classrooms, ensuring the veteran speakers had everything they needed. They were forced to serve the very men they'd failed to respect. It was a subtle but profound penance. Listening to story after story of quiet, unassuming heroism, day after day. About a year later, Robert was in a hardware store searching for a specific bolt for his old lawnmower. A young man in Army PT gear approached hesitantly. It was Daniels. He was leaner. The arrogance had been stripped away, leaving something more humble underneath. "Sir," he began, his voice uncertain. "Mr. Hayes, I don't know if you remember me." "I remember," Robert said simply. "What I did was unforgivable. There's no excuse." Daniel swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." There was no grand speech, no dramatic plea, just honesty. Robert extended his hand. Daniels took it, surprised by the strength in the old man's grip. "We all have things to learn, son," Robert said quietly. "The important thing is that you keep learning." He gave a small nod, turned back to the bolts. The conversation for him already over. Because that's what quiet professionals do. They don't demand recognition. They don't need parades. They do what's right, then move on to the next task. To everyone who typed respect and shared where you're watching from, thank you for honoring our hero's legacy. Subscribe for more stories of unsung American heroes who changed history in silence. See you in the next one.